Welcome to IC Miami, and this is the second public lecture as part of this season's seminar series on the arts in Jamaica. This seminar series and public lecture is part of the Art and Research Center's broader seminar series, which brings artists and scholarly perspectives on Jamaica and its modern contemporary cultural production from a variety of art historical, social, and historical perspectives. The series aims to think about Jamaica's past and present cultural trajectories through its local context as well as its broader diasporic influence across the Caribbean, Miami, and beyond. Our public program will continue next week with a public talk by Dr. Annie Paul on contemporary art in Jamaica, so please plan to join us at the museum next week. And like all of our programs, this program, as well as our additional initiatives, is funded by the Knight Foundation. So for tonight's lecture, I want to introduce Dr. Donette Francis, who's led seminars this week with our cohort of students. Donette Francis is the director for the Center for Black Studies at the University of Miami. Her research and writing investigates place, aesthetic, and cultural politics of the African diaspora. Professor Francis is the author of Fictions of Feminine Citizenship, Sexuality and the Nation in Contemporary Caribbean Culture. She is currently working on a book project on Miami, Creole Miami, Black Arts at the Hemispheric Crossroads, a sociocultural history of Black arts practice in Miami from 1970s to the present. She is the co-founder of the Jamaican Cultural Political Modern Project, which convenes symposia and publishes essays that rethink Jamaica's historiography. Essays from the proceedings of the Jamaican 1950s, 1960s, 1970s are published in Small Acts, a Caribbean journal of criticism. So we'll open the floor at the end of the talk for Q&A. Thank you for leading seminars this week, Donette, and we're excited to hear your talk.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this series. It's really, it was really wonderful to go back to the Jamaica work after having felt like I've abandoned it for the last 2 to 3 years. And so I look forward, to giving this talk. I feel like it brings together my Jamaica and Miami interests. And so, here we go. So I open with this slide and Jamaican art lovers will know Barrington Watson's 1959 painting called Mother and Child, and it holds significant place in the subject of my talk's cultural memory of Jamaica. And in fact, when I get a bit more in her story, part of what you'll find out is that that was the piece, in fact, that she wanted to purchase, which now actually holds pride of place in the National Gallery of Jamaica. Okay, all right, okay. So these are 2 quotes that I'm beginning with from Vicki Sila. The first time I walked into a gallery with money was when I was literally leaving Jamaica. Prior to that, I had picked up some Albert Huey prints and woodcuts. I sold my car in 1978, and I had 5,000 Jamaican dollars. The rule was you could not leave Jamaica with more than 50 Jamaican dollars. And so for the first time, I had money to buy art. Art became the currency that I could travel with, and I bought the things that would be memory. I know that Jamaica does not still exist. These works may not be big A art that is solving a problem. This is memory. You have to also credit those people who left their homes and have brought their memories with them. This art on the wall represents the Jamaica of my memory. I know that if I were to return to Jamaica, this Jamaica doesn't exist anymore. So my talk today brings together 2 social histories often taken for granted and critically overlooked in the migration stories of both Jamaica and Miami. the Jamaican exiles of the late 1970s and 80s. Stories of the mass exodus of these Jamaicans take on mythic proportions and have been part of the everyday Jamaican folklore of politics, migration, and movement, as well as the displacement and remaking of home space, both on the island and in Miami and greater South Florida. Jamaicans of the 1970s generation know well the missive uttered by Prime Minister Michael Manley on public television, quote, "If you don't like my policies, there are 5 flights a day to Miami and you can get out of Jamaica," end quote. So the implicit injunction was that if citizens were unhappy with his experiment in democratic socialism, they could relocate to Miami. And while migration has historically been a staple of Jamaican life for economic and educational opportunities, as it correlated with immigration policies of receiving countries, there was an uptick of outmigration during the decade of the long 1970s. Yet the everyday nuances of these backstories remain largely unexplored. Who were the Jamaicans of that generation that left? And what became of them in their lives in Miami? Where one strain of scholarship and creative writings frame this period around the entanglements of politics, violence, and the drug trade as push factors for migration, I want to pursue what this period might also tell us about art and cultural memory. Under Manley's policy, so the lore went, those who elected to leave the island could only do so with 50 Jamaican dollars in cash. It is important to contextualize that in 1975, the US dollar and the Jamaican dollar were still very close to each other. And in fact, before 1973, a Jamaican dollar was worth more than a US dollar. The oil shocks of 1973 to 1974 changed that valuation, but by 1980, the exchange rate was still roughly 2 Jamaican dollars to 1 US dollar. Althea Vicki Silvera's statement in the opening epigraph stake a claim for the value she attaches to art as she prepares to migrate. Certainly, works of art are not the foremost preoccupation of most people leaving Jamaica at that time. We might imagine that it is not the central priority for late 20s and early 30-year-olds. Nonetheless, for Silvera, works of art becomes the currency that accompanies her into diaspora and throughout her professional journey. Silvera's story demystifies material and art collecting practices to demonstrate instead the many approaches to acquiring and patronizing the arts and the multiple ways collecting practices are formed. One dominant narrative about the push factor for female migration, especially within the middle class, was that was a response to the fear of sexual violation. Silvera recalls experiencing vulnerability around safety in 1978 and therefore made the decision to leave her island home. She remembers selling her blue Ford Escort, which she emphasizes was British-made and not a US import, for $5,000. And with $4,550, she uses that to purchase art. And she goes into HQ Gallery and Bolivar Gallery, one of the longest running galleries on the island. So this extravagance was, of course, minus the $50 that she would leave the island with. And as she puts it, for the first time, she had enough money to buy art. But before she had the substantial money to make pricey purchases, Silvera bought woodcuts and silk screens. This Albert Huey woodcut, entitled Pocomania, was among Silvera's early art purchases. So born on December 31st, 1920, Huey is considered one of the founding fathers of modern Jamaican painting, and his figurative art depicted landscapes and portraiture of scenes of ordinary Black Jamaican life. In the 1930s, Huey was a member of the Institute group at the Institute of Jamaica, where he received his first formal training and worked alongside the well-known painter and sculptor Edna Manley. Huey would later study abroad in London and Canada before returning to Jamaica in 1948. This piece, entitled Pocomania, elevates to the subject of art the religious practices as one example of the syncretic retention of African religious rituals in Jamaica. His almost cyclical rendering depicts the ecstatic rapture of practitioners levitating to a higher spiritual realm. The other Huey in Silvera's early collection is this untitled piece, a silkscreen that captured market women sleeping with their wares the night before market day. And it almost feels like a dance composition. But in this tight compositional space with bodies at all angles and with deep earth tone hues with vibrant flashes of red and yellow, Huey captures the beauty, again, of ordinary Black laboring Jamaicans, and in this case, Jamaican women, in their everyday ritual. Another staple in Silvera's emerging collection were pieces by Capo that similarly depict scenes of African-derived religious practices and the marketplace. So born in 1911, Malika Capo Reynolds was considered one of the most significant of the Jamaican intuitives, self-taught artist. He was also a revivalist leader, and this religious practice is prominently depicted in his artwork. So in this piece, entitled Revivalist, women are centered in triangular formation. Significantly, he does not choose to render them in the more commonplace all white, and instead he uses primary colors of red, yellow, and green, with beige and white at the outer perimeter as the women hold the rods and bowl that would be used in their ceremonial practice. In this piece, I'm actually particularly drawn to the angularity of their mask-like facial features. Thus, in his untrained hand, we see the precision of facial features underscoring the mastery of his intuitive image making. A similar proficiency for perspective is seen here in his symmetrical use of foreground, middle ground, and background in this village market piece, where the women, the houses, and the hills create a beautiful rendition of the centrality of the market to village life. It also renders an aesthetic of plenitude as a way of marking a sense of, I would argue, sufficiency, and that all of the food that one would need, that the nation needs, is in abundance on the island itself rather than an export culture or an import culture. So taken together, these artworks express Silvera's collector's eye for ordinary citizens and working class religious practices that embrace a folk-inspired Black consciousness for the newly independent nation. Importantly, they would not be the everyday scenes or rituals that she would encounter on her daily commute, traversing Constant Spring Road to and from work at the Institute of Jamaica on East Street in the 1970s, or that she would have been exposed to as a student at Immaculate High School for Girls in the 1960s. Her attraction to what would later become known as the Jamaican Intuitives would get its first show in 1979. 1 year after she leaves the island, this inaugural exhibition is curated by David Boxer for the National Gallery. So my talk today is informed by the material collecting practices of Althea Vicki Sila, the current head of special collections at Florida International University. I want to suggest that her story indexes the story of a generation. As Jamaica achieved independence in 1962, this independence generation of the 1970s invested in Jamaican art as an expression of and commitment to both the cultural arm of the nation-building project as well as to support contemporary Jamaican artists trained on the island and abroad, as well as local artisans. So artists such as Albert Huey, Capo Reynolds, and Barrington Watson, whose work we have just seen, were central to her collector's imaginary, which eventually manifests in her collection, which also includes Haitian and Brazilian art, but it's the Jamaican art that I'm focused on here today. So Silvera's story is one of a collecting and curatorial practice that was the aesthetic appreciation and cultural value of Jamaican art for and by Jamaican art buyers, and not about speculation of what the art market would yield or the accrual of market value. This, I believe, is what makes her collecting practice so antithetical to the ways in which we think about collecting and art buying, especially in today's market. Furthermore, in Silvera's migration story, we see how art objects become tangible placeholders, marking the memory of home in our various diasporic outposts. Importantly, her story underscores that art collecting is not solely the preserve of the wealthy and not solely the preserve of older, settled professionals, but instead it reveals the organic, even vernacular nature of building relationships to work of art and to artists that both elevate art and supports a cultural and social ecosystem in non-market-driven ways. So in my talk today, I want to underscore the importance this independence generation placed on supporting living artists of their generation, the educative and pedagogical role of the Institute of Jamaica in creating an art-appreciating public, and the interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary core of that generation of young intellectuals. So as a young female librarian, Vicki Silvera would be more readily understood as the librarian behind the scenes, making possible and available archival information for the other more visible male intellectuals and political figures. She recalls, for example, the day during the 1976 state of emergency that Prime Minister Manley's security force showed up to her house in their official Jamaica Defense Force armored vehicle to escort her to the Institute to do research for a speech he was to give, and then returning her home. But this unseen, behind the scenes, and even perceived as feminized labor of the librarian was crucial intellectual work in the making of the new nation, and is important for a broader understanding of the complexities of its intellectual landscape. This 1970s period produced a generation of interdisciplinaries who were certainly trained in disciplines such as sociology, history, and literature, but since the field of Caribbean studies had not yet fossilized into disciplines, there was a spirit of disciplinary openness. This 1970s period produced a generation of Caribbean thinkers who thought beyond the disciplines in which they were trained, and as interdisciplinaries, their labor was in service of emerging nations and the emerging fields of Caribbean studies. So we might think, for example, of Stuart Hall's formation in the UK, as he becomes best known as the father of British cultural studies, but his first degree was actually in literature. And similarly, Orlando Patterson in the US is best known as a sociologist of New World slavery, but he was also a prolific Jamaican novelist in the 1960s and 70s. As the academic establishment in our contemporary moment begin to now center the theorizations of Sylvia Wynter, who is beyond 80, it is important to remember that she was also a dancer, playwright, and novelist in the 1960s and 70s period. So the then young Althea Vicki Sila is a product of that generation, certainly a younger member of that generation, but a member of that generation nonetheless. And is it important to document, while we still can, their critical intellectual oral histories, as they provide sensibilities of not only the Jamaica they were leaving behind, but the US they encountered. In this case, a US in the midst of anti-war protests and struggles for civil rights. Those of us in Miami and broader Caribbean intellectual circles know Vicki as the bedrock of FIU Special Collections, whereas she describes it, she is Jamaican by birth, American by choice, and Cuban by collection. The latter playful claiming of Cuban nationality intimates the impressive Cuban collection this Jamaican intellectual has been responsible for building during her 3-decade tenure at Miami's public university. During her time as head of special collections, the department has received appraised or in-kind donations of over $5 million. And as a direct result of these donations and purchases, FIU Special Collections has grown from 360 linear feet to over 5,000 linear feet and approximately 30,000 titles. But before her 36-year tenure at FIU, Silvera worked as an archivist on the Garvey papers for 4 years at the University of California, Los Angeles, and as head of public services and adjunct lecturer in Caribbean studies at Occidental College. But foundationally, before that, Silvera began her career as a librarian at the Institute of Jamaica, which also included the National Gallery from 1972. So she's there from 1972 to 1978. In this workplace setting, quote, all of the art that became the permanent collection of the National Gallery when it was founded in 1974 were all around the workplace of the Institute. And as a result, art was a part of their daily work lives as a quotidian ethos of being and appreciation of art. Furthermore, each year, the Institute put on a national exhibition of art, and their workers got to see the exhibition beforehand. So Silvera explains that as employees, they had the opportunity to meet the artists and could work out a deal to pay for the exhibiting art. Thus, in its annual exhibition and Art for the People, the sale, the Institute played an important public function in curating a taste for local art amongst the citizenry. As a young 20-something still living at home, Silvera recalls, quote, much to my mother's chagrin, every time there was an exhibition, I came home with another piece of art, end quote. Yet as Silvera continued to purchase art by emerging artists, her contemporaries and an older generation of living artists, gradually her parents' taste changed from French reproductions to appreciating Jamaican art, especially that of Ken Abedena Spencer. So in fact, by the time she's leaving Jamaica, this untitled Spencer piece that her father affectionately renamed Chups was the artwork he wanted her to leave behind in their home. So what is noteworthy about this piece is its black ink line drawings are quick sketches of a scene of 3 women in conversation. The sensuousness and grace of the loosely drawn female bodies bring special attention to the emphasis the artist placed on the purse of their lips, as if they're engaged in gossip and indifferent to observing passersby or the artist himself. Nonetheless, what I'm underscoring here is that the Institute's commitment to exhibiting art as a part of the everyday workplace is a practice that Silvera brought with her into her leadership role at FIU, where art saturates the hallways, the walls, and individual workspaces of the Stephen and Dorothea Green Library, where she has and continues to curate all the art exhibitions in the library's gallery. And after years of building community relations of trust, collectors entrust loaning art collections to her stewardship. And so I encourage you to visit the fourth floor of the Green Library, where currently on view is the collection of the Jamaican doctor, Dr. James Fitzgerald Ford, who has an impressive collection that includes works by old Jamaican masters such as Barrington Watson, Don Scott, Osmond Watson, and Saya Parbassing. And it was going to pick up a piece of art at Vicki's workplace at FIU and coming off the elevator that inspired me down this journey to actually tell her story. The artwork on the walls of that fourth floor are just stunning. It's stunning, and it really is worth going to FIU fourth floor to go see. So here Silvera sits at her desk with a 74.5 by 75.5 inch poster of Faith Ringgold's Church Picnic Story Quilt, 1988, which has hung over her office wall for the last 35 years. Faith Ringgold tells the often bittersweet story or history of daily life in Black America from a personal and feminist perspective, combining traditions of storytelling and quilt making in her painted story quilts. In Church Picnic Story Quilt, quilting represents an intergenerational activity shared by Ringgold's mother and grandmother, reflecting their strong familial female bond. This piece was commissioned for the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, and it's set in Atlanta's Piedmont Park in 1909, a year of unprecedented growth in the city, and in Ringgold's mind, a time of optimism and renewed community for African Americans in the South. So Silvera recalls purchasing this poster for $10 at the High Museum in Atlanta. And while it's now worth $600 and maybe more, what matters most is not its monetary worth, but rather the value Ringgold and her work have held over the past 3 decades in grounding Black feminist storytelling practice that through the intergenerational art of quilt making narrates stories of Black communal life. This Faith Ringgold poster depicting the original artwork of tie-dyed printed fabrics and acrylic on cotton canvas has greeted Silvera upon entering her office every workday for the past 3 decades. We can imagine upon Ringgold's recent passing the sentimental value this piece now holds for Silvera today. So while 1978 was the first time Silvera had serious money to buy art, her art collecting practice started with small purchases of mostly carvings and ceramic. At 18 years old, she purchased her first carving, this mask, by Mr. Buckner, a local wood sculptor who displayed his work on Constant Spring Road, a thoroughfare that was a part of her daily commute to and from work. As she recalls, her father gave her $18 on her 18th birthday, and this is what she purchased for herself. So sculptural wood carvings show a local economy that repurposed local woods to make art, but it also supported an informal economy where local artisans could display their work to earn an income. And Vicki says, I love his rough carvings of mask. That Buckner piece has gone with me to Canada, where she went to librarian school, to Los Angeles and is with me now in my living room here in Miami. The Owen Gordon carvings are other examples of her early wood sculpture collection, and she has several of his pieces both in her work office and at home. A Rastafarian intuitive, whenever Gordon needed lunch money, as she tells the story, or as she recalls, he would come to me. And she continues that Gordon was also able to participate in the master workshops that the Institute of Jamaica sponsored, such as when Ugandan carvers came. So Gordon would learn their techniques, and as she notes, you can see in his work when he picked up the African influence. So as a lifelong curator of Jamaican art, Vicki's practice tells us about art as both archive and ancestral memory. Knowing that she would be in exile, she bought those things that would remind her of her Jamaica. The pieces she purchased with the 4,550 Jamaican dollars were of the Jamaican landscapes she knew and felt intimately, and the working class African Jamaican cultural practices she revered. It is a story about artistic renderings of the specificity of place, down to recognizable corners in specific parishes. These scenes evoke memories of ordinary rituals, such as routine family outings to the St. Elizabeth and Port Antonio countryside to visit extended family members. These are not scenes of the rushed everyday city life, and in the main, Silvera does not collect art of urban subjects and the urban landscape. So this Alexander Cooper, another piece entitled Pocomania, she cites as her second significant purchase. And while it represents the African retention spiritual practice that is a pattern of her collection, this one, I think, importantly, is marked by the sounds of drumming as the catalyst for movement. So these levitating figures appear enraptured, if not possessed, by the rhythms. Again, with this money, Silvera also purchases this second Spencer. This is another Ken Abedena Spencer piece. Of a fisherman's village in Port Antonio, and she recalls that this particular piece struck a chord because it was right by where her uncle lived, and so she knew that village intimately. This Rodney is another purchase with her funds, and this is a pastel, and she says this happens to be the face of the woman who actually sold her the piece. And so I'm just going to show you a few of the other pieces in her early collection. So a Carl Parbusing, a David Pottinger, and this is of East Street near the Institute of Jamaica. And then finally, this is a female piece in her collection, but all she has is that it's from M. Allison, and she buys this one because it was framed at Hill's Gallery, and so for her, that was a particular provenance that allowed her to trust the work itself, but we haven't been able to find, or she hasn't been able to find, as the good archivist that she is, any more information about this female artist. So Silvera's story, I argue, tells us something about a generation of young cultural intellectual workers and their collecting habits and tastes for Jamaican art that have shaped a body of Caribbean aesthetics that both values and centers folk representations, as well as the role of the folk in seeing modern Jamaica. It tells us about artists making a living and producing art for the new nation. Her collecting practice of Jamaican intuitives and the early masters aligns with that independence generation's commitment to elevating the folk, and that such subjects were in large part not only the contemporary art of the period, but also the desirable representation of the new nation. This folk understanding of the self as African marks a decisive awareness of the self as not colonial, but rather as independence marked, an independence marked by Afro-Indigenous self-making. These are the values of the new nation that she brings with her abroad and in her collecting and curatorial practice. So I'll close by way of an invitation on Vicki's behalf. And the invitation is this. To those of us who are collectors of Jamaican art or who have original artwork by Jamaican artists in our collections, Silvera is now engaged in an open source project to locate Jamaican art in diaspora to create a database. We might call this her curation of an archive of Jamaican art for the future. The goal is to have a registry of Jamaican art, so if there was ever a desire to do a show on a specific theme, on a decade, a period, or a major master, curators would know how and with whom to find them. And so you can find her here at silverav@fiu.edu. So thank you for listening to this talk, and I want to thank Vicki for her model of collecting and her archival stewardship of Jamaican art. Thank you.